What if one of the most popular ideas in spirituality is completely misunderstood? What if the endless talk about destroying the ego is actually creating more confusion than clarity? Think about it. Millions of people meditate. Millions read spiritual books. Millions search for enlightenment. And yet many of them are secretly fighting a war against themselves. They are trying to kill something they don't even understand. They are trying to eliminate the ego. But before you decide whether the ego should disappear, you need to ask a more important question. What exactly is the ego? Most people cannot answer this question clearly. They use the word constantly. They blame their ego. They criticize other people's ego. They speak about ego death. But ask them what the ego actually is, and the answers become vague and contradictory. Today we are going to examine a possibility that many people are not prepared to consider. What if pure consciousness does not require the destruction of the ego? What if the ego never completely disappears? And what if the desire to destroy the ego is itself another trick of the ego? Listen carefully. This may challenge everything you think you know. 1. The child who had no self-image. Think back to childhood. When you were very young, you probably did things without worrying about how they looked. You danced without embarrassment. You sang without caring whether your voice was good. You ran around with food on your face. You asked strange questions. You made mistakes in public. You laughed loudly. You cried openly. You expressed yourself naturally. Why? Because you were not constantly monitoring yourself. You were not obsessed with your image. You were not measuring yourself against everyone around you. You were simply experiencing life. Many adults remember this state and call it innocence. And they miss it. Deep down, they long for it. They want to feel free again. Free from judgment. Free from anxiety. Free from self-consciousness. Free from the endless pressure to be someone. This longing is real. But many people misunderstand what they are actually longing for. They think they want the disappearance of the self. What they really want is freedom from psychological suffering. Those are not the same thing. 2. The moment everything changed. As children grow older, something begins to happen. Puberty arrives. Social awareness increases. Sexuality develops. Competition appears. Status becomes important. Acceptance becomes important. Attraction becomes important. Suddenly people become aware of how they appear to others. And with that awareness comes comparison. Am I attractive enough? Am I smart enough? Am I successful enough? Am I respected enough? Am I important enough? The mind becomes a judge, a critic, a prosecutor, a constant evaluator. And this creates enormous suffering. Many people spend decades trapped in this cycle. Every day they compare. Every day they measure. Every day they worry. Every day they seek approval. Every day they fear rejection. The tragedy is that they start believing this suffering is their true self. It isn't. It is a psychological process. A mental habit. A survival strategy. But because it feels personal, they identify with it completely. 3. The great confusion about ego. Now we arrive at one of the biggest confusions in spirituality. The word ego often gets used to describe several completely different things. This creates tremendous misunderstanding. Sometimes ego means arrogance. Sometimes ego means pride. Sometimes ego means self-image. Sometimes ego means identity. Sometimes ego means self-awareness. Sometimes ego means the entire psychological structure of the mind. These definitions are not identical. Yet people talk about them as though they are. This creates chaos. If someone says, destroy the ego, what exactly are they talking about? Should arrogance disappear? Probably. Should unhealthy attachment disappear? Probably. Should constant comparison disappear? Probably. Should psychological suffering disappear? Hopefully. But should awareness of your own existence disappear? That is a completely different question. And this is where many spiritual discussions become confused. 4. Pure consciousness and direct perception. Many spiritual traditions speak about pure consciousness. Others call it direct perception. Others call it non-dual awareness. Different names. Similar insights. In this state, reality is experienced directly. There is less interference from mental stories. Less judgment. Less comparison. Less resistance. Less psychological noise. You are not constantly filtering experience through concepts. You are simply present. The sound of the wind. The feeling of breathing. The movement of life. The reality of this moment. Many people describe this as profound freedom. And they are right. Because when judgment disappears, suffering decreases dramatically. When comparison disappears, insecurity weakens. When self-image becomes less important, fear loses power. Life feels lighter. More open. More immediate. But notice something important. Awareness remains. Experience remains. Consciousness remains. The fact that you exist remains. The feeling of, I am, remains. 5. The, I am, does not disappear. This is the point many people overlook. Pure consciousness does not mean unconsciousness. You still know you are here. You still perceive. You still act. You still think. You still feel. You still exist. A person in deep awareness does not suddenly become incapable of functioning. They do not forget their body exists. 6. The hidden self-hatred. Now we reach a difficult truth. One that many people do not want to hear. Sometimes the desire to destroy the ego is actually disguised self-hatred. Think about it. Many people secretly dislike themselves. They dislike their fears. They dislike their insecurities. They dislike their desires. They dislike their flaws. They dislike their weaknesses. And because they dislike these things, they seek a spiritual solution. They say, I must destroy my ego. But what they are really saying is, I want to get rid of the parts of myself that make me uncomfortable. This is not liberation. This is avoidance. And avoidance never leads to freedom. Freedom comes from understanding. Freedom comes from awareness. Freedom comes from seeing clearly. Not from self-rejection. 7. The trap of spiritual ambition. There is another danger. Spiritual ambition. The ego can use spirituality to make itself feel superior. A person begins meditating. They begin studying philosophy. They begin exploring consciousness. Wonderful. But then something strange happens. They start creating a new identity. I am more conscious than others. I am more awakened than others. I understand truth better than others. Now the ego has simply changed clothes. The game continues. The comparison continues. The status seeking continues. The suffering continues. Only now it wears spiritual language. This is why genuine awareness requires honesty. Brutal honesty. You must be willing to see every trick of the mind. Even the spiritual ones. Especially the spiritual ones. 8. What actually changes? If the ego never completely disappears, what changes? Everything. And nothing. The body remains. The mind remains. Thoughts remain. Emotions remain. Awareness remains. But identification weakens. You stop believing every thought. You stop obeying every fear. You stop chasing every desire. You stop defending every image. You stop fighting reality. You begin seeing things as they are. Not as your insecurity wants them to be. Not as your ambition wants them to be. Not as your fear wants them to be. As they are. This clarity transforms life. 9. The final realization. Perhaps pure consciousness is not the absence of self. Perhaps it is the absence of confusion. Perhaps it is not the destruction of awareness. Perhaps it is the purification of awareness. Perhaps enlightenment is not becoming less human. Perhaps it is becoming fully human. Without deception. Without pretense. Without psychological warfare against yourself. The search ends when you stop trying to become something else. The search ends when you stop running from yourself. The search ends when awareness sees clearly. And in that seeing, the struggle begins to dissolve. Not because the ego was killed, but because it was understood. Conclusion. So, is it possible to achieve a state of pure consciousness where ego does not exist? The answer depends on what you mean by ego. If ego means anxiety, comparison, image-making, insecurity, and psychological suffering, then yes, those can lose their grip. But if ego means the simple awareness that I exist, then no. That awareness remains. Pure consciousness is not the destruction of existence. It is freedom from unnecessary psychological burden. And that changes everything. The greatest mistake is not having an ego. The greatest mistake is believing that fighting yourself will make you free. The moment you stop trying to destroy yourself and start understanding yourself, a different kind of intelligence appears. A quiet intelligence. A clear intelligence. A liberated intelligence. And perhaps that is what pure consciousness was pointing toward all along. Most people spend their lives fighting themselves. Question. Do you think the ego should be destroyed or understood? Destroyed or understood? Let's see what people really believe.